So picture this. You wake up one day and something in your head just feels wrong. Maybe you're hearing things that aren't there. Maybe the sadness has gotten so heavy you can't get off the ground. Maybe your thoughts are racing so fast you can't finish a sentence. Today, in most of the world, you'd go see a doctor, maybe get a diagnosis, maybe get medication, maybe just get someone to talk to who actually knows what they're doing. But rewind the clock a few thousand years and things get a lot weirder, a lot darker, and honestly, sometimes a lot more surprising than you'd expect. Because ancient humans did not have psychiatry. They didn't have neuroscience. They didn't even have the concept of mental illness the way we think about it now. What they had were spirits, demons, angry gods, bad blood, and a whole lot of guesswork. And what they did with that guesswork ranged from shockingly cruel to, weirdly enough, more compassionate than what would come centuries later. So let's dig into the strange, brutal, and occasionally kind of touching history of how our ancestors dealt with the mentally ill. Let's start about 7,000 years ago, because this is where things get immediately unsettling. Archaeologists have dug up skulls from the Neolithic period all over the world, from France to Peru to China, with holes drilled straight through the bone. This practice is called trepanation, and it might be the oldest form of medical intervention humans ever performed. Now here's the thing that trips people up. We used to assume trepanation was purely for physical injuries, like relieving pressure from a skull fracture. And sometimes it probably was. But a lot of researchers believe some of these holes were drilled into people with no visible injury at all. So why would you take a sharpened stone and just start grinding a hole into someone's head who looks perfectly fine on the outside? The leading theory is that ancient people believed mental distress, seizures, hallucinations, and severe headaches were caused by evil spirits trapped inside the skull. And if a spirit is trapped inside your head, well, obviously the solution is to give it an exit. Drill a hole, let the demon fly out, problem solved. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. Many of these skulls show signs of healing around the hole. That means the person survived. Not just survived the procedure, but lived for years afterward. Which tells us two things. One, ancient surgeons, if we can call them that, were more skilled than we'd assume with zero anesthesia and zero understanding of infection. And two, this practice was common enough and survivable enough that it wasn't some rare, desperate, one-off ritual. It was, in a very real sense, ancient medicine. Now let's jump forward to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, home to the first cities, the first writing, and unfortunately, some of the first recorded ideas about mental illness being a punishment. The Babylonians and Assyrians believed that if you were mentally unwell, you had done something to anger a god, or you'd been cursed by an enemy, or a demon had simply decided to move into your body like an unwanted roommate. There's actually a demon in Mesopotamian mythology named Idta, believed to specifically cause what we might now call depression or mania. Treatment usually fell to two very different professionals. You had the ASU, who was basically a physician dealing with herbs and physical remedies, and then you had the Ashipu, who was more of an exorcist priest dealing with incantations, rituals, and spiritual cleansing. If you were mentally ill in ancient Mesopotamia, you were probably going to see the Ashipu, because your condition was seen as spiritual, not physical, and the treatments could get intense. We're talking chanting, amulets, sacrifices, and sometimes public rituals meant to shame the demon out of you, because nothing says "get better soon" like your entire community watching a priest yell at the evil spirit currently living in your skull. Ancient Egypt gives us a slightly different flavor of the same basic idea, but with an interesting twist because the Egyptians were actually pretty advanced when it came to medicine in general. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, dating back over 3,000 years, actually describes conditions that sound a lot like depression and dementia. And get this, some Egyptian physicians linked these conditions to the heart, not the brain, because they believed the heart was the seat of emotion and thought. The brain to them was basically packing material. Fun fact, during mummification, the brain was often just scooped out through the nose and thrown away, while the heart was carefully preserved because they thought that's where the real you lived. So imagine explaining depression to an ancient Egyptian doctor and having them nod thoughtfully and say, "Ah yes, your heart is unhappy," while your actual brain, the organ doing all the suffering, gets tossed in the trash a few years later during your funeral prep. Egyptian treatment for mental distress could include prayer, temple sleep, where you'd sleep in a temple hoping a god would visit you in a dream and offer guidance, and in some cases, actual recommendations for engaging in activities like art, music, or recreation, which honestly sounds like the first recorded version of art therapy. So credit where it's due. Now let's talk about ancient Greece, because this is where the story takes a genuinely fascinating turn. The Greeks are often credited with beginning the shift away from purely supernatural explanations and towards something resembling actual medical theory. Hippocrates, the guy your doctor's oath is technically still named after, proposed that mental illness wasn't caused by angry gods or vengeful spirits, but by an imbalance of bodily fluids, specifically what were called the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this theory, too much black bile caused melancholia, which is essentially ancient Greek for depression. Too much yellow bile made you manic or irritable. This might sound completely ridiculous to us now, and honestly, it kind of is. There's no actual black bile organ pumping sadness through your veins, but consider what this actually represented at the time. This was one of the first attempts in recorded history to explain mental illness as a physical, biological process rather than a punishment from the divine. That's a massive shift. Suddenly, being mentally ill wasn't automatically your fault, or a sign you'd angered some deity. It was just your body being out of balance, like a car that needs its oil changed. Treatments under this theory included changes in diet, exercise, bloodletting to remove excess humors, and even early forms of talk therapy, where physicians would actually sit and listen to patients describe their symptoms. Plato and Aristotle also weighed in, with Plato arguing that mental illness could stem from an imbalance between the rational and irrational parts of the soul, and suggesting that people experiencing severe mental illness shouldn't be held fully responsible for actions committed while unwell, which again, for the time period, is a shockingly modern idea. But don't get too comfortable thinking the Greeks had it all figured out, because Rome took a lot of these ideas and ran with them in some very mixed directions. Roman physician Celsus documented various treatments for what he called insania, and some of his suggestions genuinely sound like they belong in a horror movie. Starvation, physical restraint, being kept in complete darkness, and in some cases physical beatings, all under the theory that shocking the body back into balance would shock the mind back into balance too. But at the same time, Rome also produced physicians like Soranus, who actually argued against harsh treatment and instead advocated for calm environments, gentle conversation, and pleasant surroundings for the mentally ill. So even within the same empire, you had two completely opposite schools of thought. One saying, terrify them back to sanity, and the other saying, maybe just be nice to them and see what happens. Spoiler alert, being nice to them generally worked better, but that lesson would take society roughly another 2,000 years to fully absorb. And honestly, we're still working on it. Now here's where things take a genuinely dark turn, because we're heading into medieval Europe, and this is the era most people picture when they think about the historical treatment of mental illness. As the Roman Empire collapsed and Christianity became the dominant force across Europe, the pendulum swung hard back towards supernatural explanations. Mental illness was once again seen primarily through a spiritual lens, but this time with a distinctly Christian flavor. If you were hearing voices, having seizures, or behaving erratically, you weren't just spiritually unwell. You were potentially possessed by demons, or worse, you were suspected of being in league with the devil yourself. Exorcism became a common, if terrifying, response to symptoms we'd now recognize as schizophrenia, epilepsy, or severe psychosis. Priests would perform elaborate rituals, sometimes involving prayer and holy water, which honestly sounds relatively harmless, but sometimes involving physical restraint, forced fasting, or outright violence under the belief that making the body suffer would drive out the possessing spirit. And here's the truly dark part. This era eventually blurred the line between mental illness and witchcraft accusations, especially heading into the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The infamous witch trials that swept across Europe and later colonial America almost certainly swept up countless people whose actual crime was simply having a mental illness that made them behave differently from their neighbors. Someone experiencing psychosis, talking to people who weren't there, might be labeled as communing with dark spirits. Someone with severe epilepsy having a seizure in public might be accused of being possessed. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, a witch-hunting manual published in the late 1400s, actually described symptoms that modern readers immediately recognize as mental illness, but framed them entirely as evidence of demonic influence. Thousands of people, most of them women, were tortured and executed, and it's estimated a meaningful portion of them were likely dealing with untreated psychiatric conditions rather than any actual supernatural involvement. This is genuinely one of the darkest chapters in this entire story, a moment where fear and superstition took people who desperately needed help and instead treated them as threats to be eliminated. But here's a plot twist that a lot of people don't know about, and it's honestly one of my favorite parts of this whole topic because while Europe was busy burning people at the stake, something remarkably different was happening in the Islamic world. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 14th century, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus built some of the earliest known institutions specifically dedicated to caring for the mentally ill, called Bimaristans. And these weren't dungeons. They weren't torture chambers. Physicians in these institutions, drawing heavily on the work of scholars like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, actually approached mental illness as a genuine medical condition requiring compassionate, evidence-based treatment. Patients received music therapy, they had access to gardens and courtyards for fresh air, they were given baths, therapeutic activities, and even something resembling occupational therapy. Staff were expected to treat patients with dignity, and there are records suggesting patients were engaged in conversation about their symptoms in ways that sound almost like modern clinical interviews. Ibn Sina, in particular, wrote extensively about the connection between emotional states and physical health, describing conditions that align closely with what we'd now call depression, anxiety, and even what sounds a lot like PTSD. While medieval Europe was interpreting mental illness as a sign of demonic corruption worthy of death, scholars in the Islamic world were essentially laying early groundwork for psychiatric medicine, treating patients as people who deserved care rather than punishment. It's a genuinely striking contrast, and it's a piece of history that deserves way more attention than it typically gets. Now let's swing back to Europe, because things are about to get even stranger before they eventually start getting better. By the late medieval and early modern period, you start seeing the rise of dedicated institutions for the mentally ill across Europe, but calling them hospitals is honestly being extremely generous. The most infamous example is Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, founded in the 13th century but transformed by the 1600s into something the public simply nicknamed Bedlam, a word that has since become synonymous with chaos and confusion, and for very good reason. Bedlam became less of a treatment facility and more of a spectacle. For a small fee, wealthy Londoners could literally pay to walk through the hospital and gawk at the patients, like it was some kind of horrifying zoo exhibit. Patients were chained, displayed, sometimes even put on show for entertainment. It's estimated that Bedlam drew tens of thousands of paying visitors annually during certain periods, people showing up on a Sunday afternoon not to help, not to understand, but purely to be entertained by human suffering. Sit with that for a second. An entire wing of London's economy at one point was basically built around treating mental illness as a tourist attraction. Treatments during this period, if you can even call them that, included ice baths, spinning chairs designed to disorient patients into submission, bloodletting, purging, and prolonged physical restraint. The underlying belief was still largely rooted in the idea that mental illness represented some kind of moral or spiritual failing, something that needed to be beaten, shocked, or shamed out of a person, rather than treated with any actual compassion. But stick with me because we're finally approaching a turning point, and it comes from a man named Philippe Pinel, a French physician working in Paris in the late 18th century. Pinel took over as the head physician at the Bicêtre Hospital in 1793, right in the chaos of the French Revolution. And he did something that, at the time, was considered almost radical. He proposed that mentally ill patients should be unchained. Not sedated, not restrained, not punished. Literally physically unchained from the walls they'd been shackled to. Legend has it that Pinel personally removed the chains from dozens of patients himself, and observed that many of them, once freed from physical restraint and treated with basic human dignity, actually showed significant improvement. Pinel went on to pioneer what became known as moral treatment, an approach built on the radical idea that mentally ill patients should be treated with respect, kindness, structure, and humane living conditions rather than punishment and public humiliation. This wasn't a cure, and moral treatment definitely had its limits, but it represented the first widespread institutional shift toward seeing mentally ill people as patients rather than criminals, sinners, or entertainment. Around the same time, in England, a Quaker named William Tuke was establishing similar reforms. founding the York Retreat, a facility built specifically around calm environments, useful daily activity, and treating patients as capable of self-control rather than assuming they needed to be chained down like animals. It's genuinely wild to think that this basic idea that mentally ill people deserve to be treated like human beings was considered groundbreaking as recently as the late 1700s. That's not ancient history. That's roughly the same time the United States was writing its Constitution. So when you step back and look at this entire timeline, what's the actual through line here? What connects Neolithic skull drilling to Mesopotamian exorcism, to Greek humoral theory, to Islamic bimaristans, to the horror show of Bedlam to Penel finally removing the chains? I think it's this. Throughout almost all of human history, the fundamental question people were wrestling with wasn't really how do we treat mental illness. It was what actually causes someone's mind to behave differently from everyone else's, and the answer to that question completely determined everything that followed. If you believed mental illness was caused by demons, you got exorcism. If you believed it was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, you got bloodletting and dietary changes. If you believed it was a moral failing or a sign of witchcraft, you got punishment, torture, and death. And if you believed, as the physicians in Baghdad and later Penel in Paris eventually did, that mental illness was simply a condition, a medical reality no different in principle from a broken leg or a fever, you finally started getting something that resembles actual care. The compassion wasn't really the hard part. Humans have always been capable of compassion. The hard part was the belief system underneath it, the actual framework people used to understand what mental illness even was in the first place. And honestly, that should make you think twice before feeling too smug about how far we've come. Because psychiatry as an actual medical discipline is still remarkably young, Sigmund Freud didn't start publishing his theories until the late 1800s, and a huge amount of what we now consider basic, evidence-based mental health treatment has only really existed for the past 50 to 70 years. The first antipsychotic medications weren't developed until the 1950s. Major depressive disorder wasn't even formally standardized as a diagnosis until relatively recently in medical history. So the next time you hear about some ancient practice like trepanation or exorcism and think, wow, how primitive, how could people possibly believe that, it might be worth remembering that future generations may very well look back at some of our current understanding of mental illness with that exact same slightly bewildered head tilt. We like to think we've arrived at the final, correct answer. But every single civilization throughout this entire story believed the exact same thing about their own treatments. The Mesopotamians were confident their exorcisms worked. The Greeks were confident their humoral theory was scientifically sound. The doctors running Bedlam were confident that spinning a patient in a chair until they vomited was legitimate medicine. Confidence has never been the same thing as being correct. What I find genuinely moving about this whole history, honestly, isn't the horror stories, even though there are plenty of them. It's the moments of unexpected compassion showing up in places you wouldn't necessarily expect. It's Egyptian physicians recommending music and art centuries before art therapy became an actual clinical term. It's Roman doctors like Soranus arguing for gentleness while his colleagues were still recommending starvation. It's an entire network of hospitals across the medieval Islamic world treating mental illness with music, gardens, and genuine medical curiosity, while Europe was still burning people at the stake for hearing voices. It's one French doctor, in the middle of a violent revolution, deciding that maybe, just maybe, the people chained to his hospital walls deserved to be free. Human history is not a straight line moving steadily from ignorance to enlightenment. It zigzags, it regresses. It occasionally leaps forward centuries ahead of its time in one specific place, only to fall backward somewhere else. And mental illness, more than almost any other topic in medical history, really shows just how messy, inconsistent, and deeply human that entire process actually was. So next time someone tells you that people used to think mental illness was caused by evil spirits or bad blood, just remember that wasn't stupidity. That was people doing their absolute best to explain something genuinely mysterious and frightening with the tools they had available at the time. We're still doing exactly the same thing today, just with better tools, better research, and hopefully a whole lot more compassion. And if history has taught us anything at all, it's that the compassion part has always mattered just as much as the science.